The desert had a way of swallowing sound. Out here, miles from the nearest settlement, Daniel could hear the scrape of Dustwind's hooves against rock, the jingle of tack, and the faint rasp of his own breath. Beyond that, silence. The Arizona. Evening stretched wide, painted in bruised shades of purple and red where the sun kissed the horizon. Shadows of towering saguaro cacti reached like skeletal fingers across the sand. Daniel shifted in the saddle, his muscles stiff from another long day pushing strays out of the canyon and back toward his fence line. He wasn't much of a talker, and out here there wasn't anyone to talk to anyway, just him, the desert, and Dustwind, the horse that had carried him through more storms than he cared to count. Some men had families, wives, sons to carry their name forward. Daniel had this horse, and he figured it was enough. Dustwind tossed his head, ears twitching toward a sound Daniel hadn't noticed yet. Instinctively, Daniel slowed him to a halt, scanning the rocky gulch below. A strange shape lay sprawled, near a dry creek bed half hidden by scrub. At first he thought it was another dead steer, lost to thirst or the heat. But when the shape shifted, ever so slightly, his breath caught. It was a person. Daniel dismounted, boots crunching softly against sand and stone. As he approached, his eyes adjusted, and he saw it was a woman, young, her dark hair tangled and matted with dust and blood. She wore the remnants of Apache dress, her deerskin tunic torn at the shoulder where an arrow shaft still jutted out. Another wound stained her side, the fabric there soaked deep crimson. Her face was pale under the desert grime, lips cracked and trembling as though every breath cost her more than she had left to give. Daniel froze. His gut twisted with conflict. Years of frontier living had taught him that Apaches were not to be trifled with. Settlers told tales of raids, of barns burned in the night, of ranchers and their families cut down. A man didn't survive long, out here without respecting those warnings. Yet the woman before him wasn't a warrior brandishing a rifle. She was dying. Her eyes fluttered open, black as obsidian, and locked onto his. Fear wasn't there, at least not the kind he expected. Instead, there was something raw, a mixture of defiance and despair, like a trapped animal refusing to bow to the end. She parted her lips and a whisper slipped out, broken but clear enough. "Ayoka," Daniel crouched beside her. "Easy now, don't try to talk." But she had already said what she wanted. Her name. A name was something a man remembered. He tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it to her wound, though he knew it was little use. Without care, without rest, she wouldn't last the night. He glanced back at Dustwind, his faithful companion standing patiently a few yards away. The horse could carry Ayoka swiftly, maybe back to her people wherever they were. But if Daniel put her on that saddle, it meant letting go of the one creature that had been with him through every hard mile. A cowboy without a horse was as good as dead in this land. Daniel sat back on his heels, staring at her. The desert wind picked up, whistling low through the canyon like a voice urging him one way or the other. He thought of his father's words long ago. "You only ever own what you're willing to part with, boy. Everything else owns you." He swallowed hard. Maybe he'd lost enough in life already. Family, neighbors, cattle stolen in raids. Maybe losing one more thing didn't matter. Or maybe this one choice right here was the line between being just another bitter man and something more. Daniel rose slowly, went to Dustwind, and loosened the reins. The horse nudged his arm, as if sensing the weight of the moment. "I know." "Boy," Daniel murmured, his throat tight. "But she needs you more than I do." He lifted Ayoka as gently as he could, wincing as she groaned softly. She was lighter than he expected, her body frail from blood loss. Placing her across Dustwind's back, he steadied her until she clung weakly to the mane. Daniel whispered something into Dustwind's ear, a wordless encouragement, then gave a sharp slap to the horse's flank. Dust wind surged forward, carrying Ayoka into the deepening night. Daniel watched until horse and rider blurred into shadows, until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. The desert was silent again. Only now, Daniel stood alone in it, unarmed, horseless, and with miles of empty land between him and his ranch. His sacrifice had been made, and there was no taking it back. He adjusted his hat, squared his shoulders, and began to walk. The desert never gave back what it took. Daniel knew that. Every settler who stayed long enough in Arizona territory knew that. Water, cattle, kin. Once gone, they were gone for good. That's why men out here clung so fiercely to what they had left. For Daniel, it had always been dust wind. His horse wasn't just an animal. He was warmth on cold nights, speed against danger, strength when Daniel had none left to give. Now, dust wind was nothing but a memory fading into the night. Carrying a woman Daniel barely knew. The silence pressed against him as he stood by the dry creek bed. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off, their laughter mocking his foolishness. What had he done? A cowboy without a horse was no cowboy at all. He was just another desperate man waiting for the desert to finish him. Daniel looked down at his hands, raw and bloody from lifting Ayoka onto Dustwind's back. He flexed his fingers, the ache sinking into his bones. Hell of a thing, he muttered to himself, giving up everything for a stranger. His voice sounded strange, too loud against the vast emptiness, and he let it fade. He turned toward the north, where home waited some 20 miles away. 20 miles of rock, sand, and thirst. On horseback, it was nothing, a few hours' ride. On foot, under the punishing sun, it was near suicide. Still, his boots began to move. Each step felt like betrayal, as though he were abandoning Dustwind, instead of saving someone's life. For the first few miles, adrenaline pushed him forward. He forced his mind to stay sharp, eyes scanning the ground for rattlesnakes, ears pricked for the soft tread of wolves or cougars. But when the moon climbed higher and the air grew colder, exhaustion set in. His throat burned with thirst, his stomach clenched with hunger, and every joint in his body screamed for rest. He stumbled once, then twice, catching himself on thorn, bushes that tore his sleeves. It wasn't just the desert dragging him down. It was doubt. Doubt gnawed at him worse than hunger ever could. What if Ayoka didn't make it? What if her wounds claimed her before Dustwind even reached her people? Then what? Daniel would have thrown away the only good thing in his life for nothing. A man could make 1,000 mistakes and still get back up, but this one felt final. The night deepened. A cold wind blew through the canyon, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. Daniel froze, scanning the horizon. For a moment, he thought he saw firelight flickering far away. Maybe a camp, maybe Apache, maybe outlaws. He tightened his fists, helpless without his horse or rifle. Alone, he was less than nothing. He pressed on, step after weary step. His boots raised little puffs of dust that glowed silver in the moonlight. He thought of Dustwind again, running, free beneath the stars, with Ayoka clinging weakly to his mane. He thought of the horse's loyalty, how many times Dustwind had pulled him out of danger. The image tore at him, leaving his chest hollow. He missed the weight of reins in his hand, the steady rhythm of hooves beneath him. He felt naked without it. By the time he reached a cluster of rocks, his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. The ground was hard and cold, but he didn't care. He leaned back against a stone, tilted his head, and let his eyes close for just a moment. Sleep came, though not the kind that refreshed. Memories swarmed him in half-dreams, his father's rough voice teaching him how to saddle his first colt, his mother's gentle hands brushing the hair from his brow when he was fevered, the laughter of a woman he once loved but lost to fever. years ago. They were ghosts now, whispers that belonged to another lifetime. When he woke, the stars were fading, the eastern horizon painted in gray and gold. His body ached as if he'd been trampled. He staggered upright, dusted himself off, and started again. The decision weighed heavier with each mile. It wasn't just the loss of his horse or the danger of the desert. It was the truth behind it. He had chosen compassion over survival. Out here, that wasn't just rare. It was reckless. The frontier wasn't built on kindness. It was built on grit, on men willing to kill to keep what little they had. Daniel wondered if his father would call him a fool. But deep down, beneath, the ache beneath the fear was something else. A strange warmth, like a fire banked low. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was hope. He didn't know. All he knew was that he had made his choice, and there was no undoing it. The sun was rising now, blazing red over the desert. Daniel lifted his hat to shield his eyes and kept walking. His lips cracked when he smiled faintly to himself. "Reckon I'll find out," he whispered. The desert stretched wide before him, merciless and endless. But still, he walked. The sun had a way of breaking a man. Out here, there was no shade deep enough, no wind kind enough to ease its bite. By mid-morning, Daniel was already sweating through his shirt, each bead of sweat stolen by the dry air before it had the chance to cool him. The horizon shimmered in waves of heat, blurring into something dreamlike and cruel. He kept walking, one step after another, boots dragging through sand and gravel. The rhythm became a kind of chant: left, right, breathe, swallow, repeat. Problem was, there wasn't much left to swallow. His canteen had been left hanging on Dustwind's saddle, forgotten in the rush to save the Apache woman. Now his tongue was a thick, useless slab of leather in his mouth. The desert offered no kindness. He passed brittle shrubs, cacti with arms outstretched like watchful sentinels, and the occasional lizard that darted into shadows. Each sight mocked him with life where he carried only exhaustion. He envied the lizard, small, quick, clever, enough to survive where men rarely did. By noon, the world had turned into a furnace. Heat pressed down like a physical weight, and Daniel's legs trembled. He thought about sitting, maybe just for a minute. But he knew how that story ended. A man rested in the desert, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. His father used to say the desert wasn't a killer. It was a liar. It whispered to you that you could stop, that you could rest, that you could steal just one moment. And when you listened, it took everything. So Daniel walked. As the miles stretched on, his mind began to wander. He thought of Dustwind again, galloping toward Apache country with a yoke slumped across his back. Would her people find her in time? Or would Dustwind wander aimlessly, carrying a dying woman to nowhere? The thought gnawed at him. Maybe he'd been a fool to send her off. Maybe his mercy was nothing but slow cruelty. And what then? What would the Apache do if they found her already gone? Would they see Daniel's sacrifice for what it was? Or would they brand him another enemy who had failed her? The thought of 70 angry warriors descending on his ranch twisted his stomach. The desert didn't let him dwell long. Hunger arrived next, sharp and insistent. His last meal had been jerky and beans nearly a day ago, and now his body screamed for strength he didn't have. He spotted a prickly pear cactus and tore off a pad, ignoring the sting of tiny spines in his palm. He peeled it with his knife, sucking down the sour flesh. It wasn't much, but it was something. By late afternoon, the landscape blurred. The rocks and sand shifted in his vision until he wasn't sure if he was walking toward his ranch or in circles. He stumbled once, caught himself on a mesquite tree, then stumbled again and crashed to his knees. For a long moment he stayed there, staring at the ground. That was when the doubt returned, heavier than ever. What if Ahyoka had already died? The thought came unbidden, but it stuck like a burr. He pictured her lifeless body slumped against Dustwind's mane, her hands slipping from the reins as the horse wandered without purpose. He saw her people finding her too late, her eyes closed, her lips silent forever. And in that vision, he saw himself blamed, cursed, hunted down for a mercy that had failed. His throat tightened, not just from thirst, but from despair. Maybe he had doomed them both, her to death and himself to emptiness. But then another thought crept in, a softer one. What if she lived? What if Dustwind carried her swiftly enough? What if her people nursed her back? What if the name she'd whispered, Ahyoka, was not her last word but her first in a new chapter? That possibility, however faint, was enough to spark a flicker in him. Daniel forced himself to his feet. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, rubber and bone barely holding together, but they moved. He tipped his hat lower to block the sun and pressed on. Evening came at last. Shadows stretched long across the desert floor, and the air, cooled enough for him to breathe without pain. The horizon shifted again, this time not from heat, but from distance. He thought he saw the faint outline of his ranch, a dark smudge against the fading sky. Relief surged, but he didn't trust it yet. The desert still had time to trick him one last time. He walked until the stars bloomed overhead. Each one burned sharp, like pinpricks against black velvet. Daniel stumbled again, but this time he let himself fall. He dropped by a cluster of stones, chest heaving. His body screamed for rest, and now he couldn't fight it. As his eyes closed, the desert whispered around him. Coyotes called in the distance, and wind moved low across the sand. Daniel's last thought before sleep claimed him was of Dustwind's steady gait, Ahyoka's whisper, and the chance, however slim, that his sacrifice had meant something. Darkness wrapped around him, and for the first time in years, he prayed. The desert night was cruel in a different way than the day. Where the sun burned a man hollow, the darkness chilled him to the bone. Daniel shivered as he lay against the cluster of rocks, pulling his torn shirt tighter across his chest. The warmth of the day had fled, leaving only the kind of cold that crept into a man's marrow. The stars were sharp and endless overhead, too many to count, too many to make sense of. He tried to follow their constellations, like he had as a boy when his father taught him to find north. But his mind was too fogged with exhaustion. Shapes slipped away, and all he could see was an endless black sky that seemed ready to swallow him whole. He closed his eyes, but rest did not come easy. His body ached. His lips cracked with thirst, and his stomach twisted with hunger. Yet it was not his body that tormented him most, it was his mind. Doubt came first, whispering like a rattler hidden in the brush. She's already gone. The thought slithered into him, persistent, venomous. He saw Ahyoka's face pale and still, her breath stilled before Dustwind ever carried her far enough. If that vision was truth, then his sacrifice was worthless. He had given away his only lifeline for nothing. Then came guilt. Faces he hadn't thought of in years rose unbidden in the darkness. His father, stern but proud, telling him that survival was the only law of the frontier. His mother, softer, her eyes full of kindness he'd never been able to match. And another face, a woman's, Clara. Her laughter had once filled his cabin like music, but sickness had taken her before she could ever call the place home. He had buried her alone, his hands raw from digging in dry earth. Now those ghosts circled him in his dreams and half-dreams, voices carried by the desert wind. His father's voice scolded, "You gave away the one thing that kept you alive, boy. That ain't noble. It's foolishness." His mother's voice was gentler. "Mercy is never wasted, Daniel. Even if no one sees it, the earth itself remembers. And Clara. Clara said nothing. She only smiled the way she had when she was alive, and that silence was heavier than words. He shifted against the rocks, staring at the horizon where a thin silver glow promised the moon would rise higher. His hands trembled, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't say. For the first time in years, Daniel whispered a prayer. It was awkward, halting, like speaking to a stranger he hadn't seen since childhood. "Lord," he muttered, his voice cracking in the stillness. "I don't rightly know if you're listening. Haven't given you much reason to, I reckon. But if you are, don't worry about me. I'll take whatever's coming. Just don't let that girl die. Out there, she's young, she's got a name, a people. Let her see him again. Let her keep walking." His words faded into the night, swallowed by the wind. He felt foolish, yet lighter somehow. The prayer wasn't much, barely a whisper against the vast sky, but it was all he had left. Sleep finally dragged him under. It wasn't gentle. It came with fevered dreams that twisted into visions. He saw Dustwind galloping through fire, arrows flying past his flanks. He saw Ayoka reaching for him, her hand slipping from the saddle. He reached out too, but always too late, always just short. Then the scene would shift, her eyes opening, alive, grateful, but surrounded by painted warriors who turned their lances toward him. In the dream, he could never tell if he was savior or fool. When he woke, the night was deep and still. The coyotes had gone quiet. The silence pressed heavy, the kind that made a man's heartbeat sound loud in his own ears. His body hurt worse than before, stiff and brittle from lying against stone. He pushed himself up with a groan, every joint protesting. The stars still burned overhead, cold and eternal. He thought again of his prayer, of whether it had climbed beyond the sky or fallen uselessly to the sand. He didn't know. All he knew was that dawn was coming, and with it another day he'd have to face without Dustin. Daniel wrapped his arms around himself, shivering against the cold, and leaned back against the rock. His eyelids drooped again, heavy as stone. Before, sleep claimed him a second time. He whispered the words once more. Not for himself, but for Ashoka. Keep her alive. That's all I ask. The night held no answer, only silence and the endless desert stretching out beneath the stars. The first hint of dawn crept into the sky like a whisper, faint streaks of gray giving way to thin bands of orange. Daniel stirred from uneasy sleep, his back stiff from the hard ground, his throat dry as cracked stone. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The night had carried him into dreams so vivid that waking felt like being torn from one world and shoved into another. When the truth returned, that he was alive, horseless, and stranded, he almost wished the dream had kept him. He pushed himself up slowly, joints aching as though years had been added to his body overnight. His lips split as he licked them, tasting blood where they had dried. He brushed the dust from his shirt and scanned the horizon. The desert stretched wide and endless, painted in pale light. It looked softer at dawn, almost gentle, as though mocking him with beauty after the night's cruelty. He staggered to his feet, legs unsteady but moving. Ahead, perhaps 6 miles away, he thought he saw the outline of his ranch. Low fences, a dark smudge of cabin roof. His heart lifted, then fell. Out here, mirages were as common as lizards. A man could walk toward salvation all day only to find sand waiting for him. Still, it was something to fix his eyes on, something to drag him forward. Step after step, he trudged through the chill air. Each breath stung his lungs with the sharp bite of cold, but he welcomed it. Better the cold than the sun. The desert had 2 faces, one that burned and one that froze, and both wanted him dead. At last, as the sun climbed higher, the shape of his ranch grew clearer. The cabin was real this time. He could see the tilt of the roof, the fence posts leaning at odd angles, the corral gate hanging loose where he'd been meaning to fix it for weeks. Relief swept through him, not joy exactly, but the deep kind that steadies a man's knees when they're about to buckle. He reached the well first. The rope creaked as he lowered the bucket, the sound so familiar it almost made him weep. When the bucket splashed into water, he hauled it up with shaking arms, nearly spilling half of it in his hurry. The first swallow was heaven and fire both, the cold water shocking his parched throat. He drank until his belly ached, then let the rest run over his head and shoulders, washing away the dust of miles. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to breathe, to lean against the well and feel alive. Again, he thought maybe, just maybe, he had survived the worst of it. Then the silence came. It was subtle at first. The bird song that usually filled the morning was gone. No sparrows in the mesquite, no hawks circling overhead. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Daniel straightened, every nerve alert. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know that silence was never innocent. He scanned the horizon, squinting against the rising sun. The land looked empty, but something in his gut clenched. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm, the kind that pressed down on a man's chest until he couldn't ignore it. He stepped toward his cabin, boots crunching on the hard earth. His hand twitched toward his hip, but of course the holster there was empty, his revolver still hanging from the saddle of the horse he had given away. The realization sent a chill deeper than the night air. Alone, unarmed, and vulnerable. Daniel paused by the cabin door, listening. The silence was so thick he could hear his heartbeat in his ears. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the exhaustion, the hunger, the lingering fear from the night before. But then, faint and distant, came a sound that froze him where he stood. Hooves. At first he thought it was his imagination, but the rhythm was steady, unmistakable, the drumming of many horses moving as one. The sound carried over the still desert, like a war drum, deep and relentless. His stomach dropped. Daniel turned slowly toward the east, the direction of the rising sun. Against the glare, he saw only dust at first, a long rising plume that curled and shimmered in the light. Then faint figures emerged, dark silhouettes riding in formation. His pulse quickened as the truth struck. It wasn't one rider, not even a handful. It was dozens. He gripped the doorframe of his cabin, steadying himself as the sound grew louder. 70 horses, maybe more. Their hooves beat the earth with a power that made the ground tremble beneath his boots. The silence of the dawn was shattered now, replaced by the thunder of their approach. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For the first time since giving up Dustwind, fear pressed hard into him, not the kind that came from thirst or hunger, but the kind that came from knowing your life was no longer your own. The riders were coming, and there was no place to run. The ground trembled before the riders came into full view. Daniel stood rigid by the cabin door, his hand gripping the weathered wood as if it could anchor him against what was about to descend. Dust rose in a rolling cloud across the horizon, swallowing the early light of dawn. Through that haze, the figures sharpened, dark shapes atop swift horses, their movements synchronized like waves crashing onto shore. 70. Maybe more. He stopped counting after 30, because the truth was already too much for one man to swallow. The riders crested, a low ridge east of his ranch, the sun striking their painted faces, their long hair streaming behind them. Apache warriors. Their presence carried the weight of a storm, silent, but charged with the kind of power that could tear a man's life apart in an instant. Daniel's mouth went dry. He stepped back from the doorway, every instinct in him screaming to reach, for a weapon, to arm himself, to do something. But his gun was gone. His rifle, too. He had nothing. Just his cabin, his fences, and his bare hands. Against 70 mounted warriors, those weren't worth a damn. He thought about running. But where? The desert would swallow him whole before he'd made it a mile. He thought about hiding, but the cabin was nothing but timber and nails. It wouldn't withstand a single spark if they chose to burn it. No. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. So he stood. The riders slowed as they neared his land, hooves pounding softer, more deliberate. Dust rose around them in golden clouds, catching the light of the rising sun. Their faces came into focus, stern, unreadable, painted with lines of white and red that gave them the look of spirits more than men. Lances glinted in the light, feathers fluttered from spear shafts, rifles rested across strong backs, and at their head, riding tall on a horse Daniel knew better than his own heartbeat, was a yoka, Dustwind. His horse, his friend, his soul on 4 legs. Daniel's chest tightened as he saw the animal. Dustwind's ears pricked forward, mane whipping in the wind, legs steady and strong, and on his back, a yoka sat upright. Her skin still looked pale, her wounds wrapped in fresh bandages, but her eyes, dark, piercing, were alive. Fiercely alive. For a long moment, Daniel forgot the 70 warriors surrounding her. His gaze locked on Dustwind, on the familiar rhythm of the horse's stride. A lump rose in his throat, something between grief and relief. The horse had carried her to safety, just as Daniel had prayed. Dustwind had done his duty, but the sight also brought fear crashing back. If Ahyoka was here, it meant she had found her people. It meant they knew what Daniel had done, taken her, given her his horse, sent her back. Would they see it as mercy or meddling? The riders drew closer until they formed a semicircle around his ranch. Hooves struck the earth in perfect unison before falling still. The silence returned, heavier than before. Daniel stood in the center of it, the lone figure of a rancher surrounded by warriors who could erase him from the earth with a single command. Ahyoka raised her hand, slender but steady. The warriors obeyed at once, halting in absolute stillness. The dust settled around them, softening the edges of the moment, yet Daniel's heart thundered louder than the hooves had moments before. She looked at him then, not as a stranger, not as an enemy, but with a gaze that cut straight through the silence. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. She simply looked at him, as if weighing something far larger than life or death. Daniel's breath caught. He had no weapon, no horse, no plan. All he had was the choice he had made in the canyon, the sacrifice of Dustwind for her life. Whatever happened now would be the judgment for that choice. Finally, Ahyoka spoke. Her voice carried clear in the morning air, strong despite her healing wounds. "He is the one," she said in English, her accent thick but her meaning sharp. She gestured toward Daniel. "This man?" The circle of warriors shifted slightly, their eyes all turning to him. Daniel's skin prickled under the weight of their stares. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with coldness, but none with mercy. For the first time in years, Daniel felt utterly small, not just in the shadow of 70 armed warriors, but in the face of something greater than himself. The desert, the choices he'd made, the thin line between life and death, all of it had brought him here, to this moment. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice past the tightness in his throat. "I gave her my horse," he said quietly, though the words sounded hollow against the silence. "That's all." Ahyoka's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened just enough for him to see it. Behind her, the warriors did not move. They waited. For what? Daniel couldn't yet tell. But he knew one thing: the desert hadn't finished with him. This was only the beginning. The air was so heavy, Daniel swore it pressed on his chest. The warriors did not move, their faces carved in stone, their silence more threatening than shouts. Daniel's palms itched, his throat tight. He'd faced storms, rattlesnakes, and cattle. Drives gone wrong, but nothing compared to this. Standing alone while 70 warriors sat mounted, waiting for a single command. He expected the command would not spare him. Ahsoka still sat on Dustin, her back straight, her hand raised with authority. Though her bandages were visible beneath her buckskin dress, she seemed transformed. No longer the frail, injured woman Daniel had carried from the canyon, but a proud daughter of her people, alive with fire. Her eyes lingered on him, dark and unreadable. Daniel didn't know whether they burned with gratitude, accusation, or both. At last, she dismounted. Dustin whinnied softly as she slid down, her bare feet touching the earth with deliberate grace. The warriors didn't stir, though Daniel noticed their gazes follow her every movement. She walked slowly toward him, the morning light casting long shadows across the dirt. Daniel's breath came shallow. He wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of his cabin, but he forced himself to stand his ground. If this was judgment, he would face it standing tall. She stopped a few paces from him. Dustin pawed the ground behind her, restless, as though sensing the storm building in the silence. "You gave me your horse," Ahsoka said. Her voice was clear now, steadier than when she had first spoken. "Why?" Daniel swallowed hard, his lips dry. He thought about lying, about saying something clever to soften whatever this was leading to. But he had nothing clever left in him. Truth was all he had. "I couldn't leave you there," he said quietly. "You were wounded, alone. My horse was the only chance you had. He's everything to me. But your life—" His voice caught, surprising him. He steadied it. "Your life mattered more." A flicker crossed her face. Something softer than suspicion, gentler than anger. Yet it was gone too quickly to read. She turned, raising her hand again, not to signal the warriors to attack, but to beckon one of them forward. A rider nudged his horse ahead. He was older than the others, his hair streaked with gray, his chest adorned with bone beads and painted symbols. His gaze on Daniel was sharp enough to cut. He dismounted as well, joining Ahsoka at her side. "This man," she said in Apache, her words foreign, but her tone commanding. She gestured to Daniel. The older warrior's gaze never left him as she spoke. The exchange was brief, but the tension in every syllable felt like thunder about to break. Finally, the older man stepped closer. Daniel braced himself, his fists clenched, though he knew fists would do nothing against 70 armed men. The warrior stopped within striking distance, his eyes locked on Daniel's. Then, he extended his hand. Daniel blinked, stunned. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of mountains. A warrior offering his hand to an outsider? It wasn't mercy. It was something deeper, more deliberate. Slowly, Daniel lifted his own hand and clasped it. The grip was strong, unyielding, but not hostile. The circle of warriors shifted. A murmur rolled through them, low and heavy, like wind moving through pines. Some looked surprised, others approving. None raised their weapons. Ahsoka spoke again, this time to the whole circle. Her voice carried authority despite her youth. Though Daniel couldn't understand her words, he recognized the rhythm of command, the cadence of gratitude. When she finished, she placed her hand over her heart, first toward Dustwind, then toward Daniel. It was unmistakable. She was telling them the truth of what had happened. Daniel's chest tightened. He thought of the endless nights he had spent with Dustwind on the trail, the years of companionship, the trust that had grown between them. Giving the horse away had felt like tearing out a piece of his own soul. But now, Seeing Ahsoka alive, standing proud before her people, he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. The older warrior released his hand. Ahsoka stepped closer, her eyes holding his. "You did not have to," she said softly. "But you did." Daniel gave a slow nod. Sometimes doing nothing ain't an option. For the first time, her lips curved into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Then she turned back to her people, raising her hand once more. At her. "Command!" The warriors shifted, some dismounting, others grounding their lances. No weapons were raised toward Daniel. No fire was lit against his cabin. Instead, the impossible began to unfold. The warriors dismounted in peace, as if this rancher had earned not their wrath, but their respect. Daniel's knees nearly buckled, with the weight of relief, but he held firm. He knew better than to think himself safe. This was only the beginning of something larger. Still, as the circle transformed from threat to gathering, he understood one truth clear as sunrise. His single act of sacrifice had changed the course of everything. The circle of warriors had shifted from a wall of threat into a living council. The silence that followed the handshake stretched long, punctuated only by the creak of leather saddles and the restless stamping of horses. The dawn sun rose higher, spilling golden light over the land, painting the warriors' painted faces with fire. Daniel stood at the center, uncertain whether he was still a prisoner, a guest, or something in between. Ashoka gestured toward the cabin. "We talk there," she said simply, her English clipped but firm. Daniel hesitated. His cabin was his last line of defense, the place he had built with his own two hands. Inviting 70 warriors within sight of it felt like surrendering his life entirely. Yet what choice did he have? To deny them would be foolish, an insult. To agree might buy him understanding, maybe even peace. "All right," he said, his voice steady though his chest was tight. "Inside or out?" Ashoka tilted her head toward the clearing beside the cabin, where the fire pit lay unused. "Here. All see. All know." So it began. The warriors dismounted in deliberate order, their movements disciplined, each man settling cross-legged on the earth. They formed a semicircle around Daniel's cabin, their presence like a living fortress. No words were wasted. Even in stillness, their unity was powerful, intimidating, yet strangely dignified. At the center sat the elder who had shaken Daniel's hand. His face was lined with years, his eyes dark pools of wisdom and sorrow. His name was murmured among the men, Nantan Lapa, wolf leader. Ashoka took her place at his side, though Daniel noticed the way several warriors glanced at her with reverence. It wasn't just respect for her survival, it was something deeper. As if her voice carried unusual weight among them. Daniel remained standing, shifting uneasily, the sun warm on his back, wolf leader's gaze fixed on him. The elder spoke in Apache, his words flowing with the gravity of Riverstone. Daniel didn't understand, but Ashoka translated with care. "He asks," she said slowly, "if you know what you have done." Daniel swallowed. "I gave you my horse, that's all." Her eyes flickered, pity, maybe even disbelief. She repeated his words to the elder. Murmurs rippled through the warriors like wind across prairie grass. Wolf leader answered again. Ashoka translated, "You did not only give me your horse, Dustin carried me to my people. Because of that, I live. Because of that, I speak here today." She paused, her voice tightening. "But Dustin also carried more. News. A sign." Daniel frowned. "A sign?" Ashoka turned fully to him, her gaze sharp. "Among my people, the horse you gave, your only horse, was seen as an offering. Not for me, but for the spirits, for life itself. It is not small. It is big." She pressed her hand to her chest. "To give all you have for another, it changes things. It makes the warriors listen." Daniel's throat went dry. He hadn't meant it as a ceremony, as a sacred gift. He'd simply acted because his conscience wouldn't let him walk away. But here, before these men, that act had become something larger than he ever intended. Wolf Leader spoke again, his tone deep and resonant. Ayoka translated carefully. "He says your act cannot be ignored. To our people it is sign of alliance, of friendship, of fate." The words struck Daniel harder than any threat. Alliance? Friendship? He'd spent years living alone, pushing away neighbors, building walls around his heart. He had wanted no part in alliances, yet here he was, his horse gone, his choices binding him to something vast and ancient. "What exactly does that mean?" Daniel asked, wary. Ashoka didn't soften the reply. "It means they will not take your land. They will not burn your home. They will not spill your blood." Her eyes darkened. "Instead, they ask if you will stand with them when the time comes." The clearing went utterly still. Daniel felt every warrior's gaze on him, sharp as blades. His heart pounded. He knew what she meant. The frontier was boiling with conflict. Soldiers pushing west, settlers building fences, promises broken. Sooner or later, violence would come. And now, by one choice of mercy, he had been thrust into the center of it. Wolf Leader rose slowly, his presence commanding. He stepped forward until he stood only a pace from Daniel. His words, though untranslated, carried force. Ashoka gave them shape. "He says, you are no longer just a rancher. You are bound. Dustbin's hooves have tied your spirit to ours. You cannot walk away." Daniel's breath hitched. He glanced at Ahsoka, then at the warriors, then at the horizon stretching beyond his cabin. For years, he had wanted nothing more than solitude. Yet now 70 pairs of eyes held him in a bond he hadn't asked for, a destiny he could neither deny nor undo. Daniel had hoped that the dawn's tension had passed, that the arrival of the Apache and the recognition of his act might allow the day to stretch quietly. He had been wrong. The quiet of the desert was deceptive. Birds had begun to stir, the wind rattled dry branches, and yet beneath it all there was a sense of movement, a restless energy in the air that made his skin prickle. His gaze shifted toward the horizon, toward the mountains that marked the eastern edge of his property. Something was coming, something he could not yet name. Ayoka sat near the elder, Dustwind grazing calmly at her side. She seemed serene, even regal, but her eyes flicked toward Daniel with urgency. He saw the same tension mirrored in the warriors. "The soldiers," she said softly, though it was enough to make Daniel's chest tighten. He had known the land was contested. Tensions between settlers and Apache bands were never far from the surface. But he had convinced himself that he was merely an observer, someone small and inconsequential enough to avoid notice. Now the realization hit him like a whip. His mercy had thrust him into the center of a larger game, and he was no longer invisible. The first dust clouds appeared over the distant ridgeline, and with them, the unmistakable glint of metal, rifles, spurs and sun-catching polished buttons on uniforms. Soldiers, a patrol at first, maybe 10 or 12, but Daniel knew reinforcements were never far behind in this land. He felt his heart hammering. He had never been a soldier, never led men, never even truly fought in organized combat. Yet here he was, caught between the Apache, now bound to him by respect and sacred trust, and soldiers who would see him either as a threat or an ally to be crushed. Ayoka stood and walked to him, placing a hand on his arm. The warmth of her touch grounded him, but it also reminded him of what was at stake. "They won't wait to question," she said. "They will assume. And what they assume will be fatal if we are unprepared." Daniel nodded, his fingers brushing the folds of his coat, considering the few weapons in his cabin. A rifle, A revolver, small arms against a potentially larger force. But something was better than nothing. He glanced at Dustwind, grazing at the edge of the clearing, and felt a pang of guilt for having given up his horse. Yet without that choice, Ahyoka might not be alive, and there would be no council, no alliance, no hope, the warriors murmured, among themselves forming a loose line behind the cabin. Daniel realized then that he wasn't alone, not truly. He had allies, fierce, skilled, and bound by honor in a way he hadn't known existed outside of legend. Ahyoka returned to his side. "We must send a message," she said, "to warn those coming. Not to fight yet, but to understand who stands here." Daniel studied her, then the elder. He was not fluent in Apache ways, but he understood enough to know that the gesture would be as important as any weapon. Missteps could mean death, and not just his own. He walked to the cabin, grabbing a few rifles and cartridges, checking powder and priming. Each small piece of preparation was a thread, weaving him tighter into the destiny he had not sought. As he loaded weapons, he felt the weight of choices pressing down. Every step he had taken to save a stranger had led here, and each would have consequences far beyond his ranch. The sun rose fully now, burning gold across the desert. The distant soldiers grew sharper in the light, the dust cloud rolling steadily toward the clearing. Daniel felt a shiver of fear, yes, but also of fierce determination. He had acted with courage once before, giving away Dustwind to save Ahyoka. Now courage would demand more: planning, foresight, and the willingness to stand between two worlds that were destined to clash. The warriors lined up behind him, a wall of intent and silent power. Dustwind shifted beneath Ahyoka, nickered softly, as if sensing the brewing conflict. Daniel exhaled, steadying himself against the growing tension. He realized something then. This collision, this moment, was more than just survival. It was a test of trust, honor, and the consequences of a single act of mercy. The dawn of battle, or perhaps diplomacy, was coming, and he was no longer a passive participant. The dust swirled closer, and Daniel raised his eyes to meet Ahyoka's. Her gaze was unwavering, filled with a quiet strength that mirrored his own growing resolve. "Whatever comes," she said, her voice low, "we face it together." And with that, Daniel felt the impossible truth settle in. His life, once defined by isolation and caution, was now irrevocably entwined with those he had once considered strangers. Destiny was no longer a distant horizon. It was here, charging across the desert like the soldiers now visible on the ridgeline, and there was no turning back. The dust clouds on the horizon had grown thick enough that Daniel could make out the glint of rifles and the glimmer of buttons on uniforms. The soldiers were advancing in formation, confident, disciplined, and unaware of the alliance awaiting them at the clearing. Every step they took sent tremors through the earth, and every tremor pulsed into Daniel's chest like a warning drum. Ahyoka stood near Dustwind, silent, yet commanding. Her presence radiated authority, and the warriors behind her formed a disciplined line, mounted and unmounted, a living barricade of resolve. Daniel felt a strange calm. Fear still lurked in the pit of his stomach, but courage had found its place beside it. His choice to save her had created this, and now he would stand by it to the very end. "Remember," Ahyoka said softly, her voice barely above the wind, "we do not strike first. We show strength, but we do not bring death unless forced." Daniel nodded. He adjusted the rifle in his hands, feeling its weight. The weapon was small compared to the army approaching, but it was a symbol of his preparedness, his will, and his unwillingness to bow to fate without a stand. The soldiers reached the edge of the clearing. Their leader, a tall man with a harsh jawline, rode forward, pistol resting across his saddle. He squinted at the gathering, clearly unprepared for the scene that met his eyes. 70 warriors, a single rancher standing at their center, and a young Apache woman commanding both sides with quiet authority. Daniel stepped forward unarmed, letting his hands rest at his sides. He forced himself to meet the soldier's gaze without flinching. "I am Daniel Hart," he said, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I stand with those before me, but I do not seek blood. You are welcome to turn back." The soldier sneered, spurring his horse slightly. "We don't negotiate with savages," he spat. His men murmured agreement. But Daniel noticed hesitation flicker in their eyes. Something in the line of warriors, their quiet discipline, their unflinching presence, sowed doubt. Ayoka stepped forward. "You do not understand," she said in English this time, her tone carrying the weight of command. "This man saved me. Your soldiers will not harm him without consequence." She gestured to the line of warriors. "Their lives are bound to mine. His life is now bound to ours. Violence against him brings war, not victory." The soldiers faltered. The tension was palpable, each second stretched thin across the desert air. Daniel could feel it. The delicate balance between conflict and peace, between choice and consequence. He understood fully that his small act of mercy had transformed into a force far greater than he had imagined. One of the soldiers, younger, paled as he glanced from Daniel to the warriors behind him. Doubt began to ripple through their ranks. The harsh leader's jaw tightened, but the murmur of uncertainty spread faster than words could carry. Then Ayoka moved closer to Daniel, placing a hand on Dustwind's mane. She raised her eyes, scanning the soldiers, and spoke once more. "We do not wish war, but we will protect what is ours. Your choice is simple: leave or face the consequences." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Daniel felt the eyes of Dustwind, strong and loyal, and the faces of warriors who had trusted him. He felt the weight of every mile he had walked, every drop of sweat and fear he had endured. "Fire!" Leader cursed under his breath, then signaled a halt. After a tense moment, he raised his hand in reluctant acknowledgement. Slowly, the soldiers began to withdraw, their formation breaking as they retreated toward the ridge. Dust clouds trailed them like fading echoes of a threat that had been neutralized, not with bullets, but with courage and honor. Ayoka released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Daniel, her dark eyes softened with relief and gratitude. "You chose to act when it mattered," she said. "That is why you live today, and why we stand beside you." The warriors murmured in agreement, their presence shifting from intimidating to protective. Daniel lowered his rifle, feeling exhaustion and relief crash over him. Dustwind whinnied softly, pressing his nose against Daniel's shoulder as if sensing the end of a long trial. Daniel finally allowed himself to smile, the weight of the desert, the night, and the dawn lifting from his shoulders. His heart was still racing, but it was full, not just of relief, but of understanding. The choice to give, to act selflessly, had created bonds he could never have imagined, alliances forged not in blood, but in honor. The desert stretched endless around them, but now it seemed less harsh. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, the sun warmed his back, and in that moment, Daniel realized he was no longer alone. He had been tested, tempered, and found part of something greater than himself.